People always ask me what the scariest moment of my life was. They expect me to say the night I lost my husband or the day the doctors looked at Lena and said they didn't know what was wrong. But I always tell them the same thing. It was a Tuesday evening in October when I walked into the bush to check a snare line and heard a sound that stopped my blood cold. And what I did next changed everything. For him, for me, and for a little girl who had no idea any of it was happening. If you've never heard this story before, stay with me, because this one doesn't end where you think it will. Subscribe if you're new here, and don't go anywhere, because what happens in the middle of this story is the part nobody sees coming. I need you to understand something about where I come from before I tell you what happened that evening. I grew up on the edge of Savo, not near it, on the edge of it, where the red dust of the road turns into something older, something that doesn't have a name in any language I know, where the acacia trees grow sideways because the wind has been pushing them for 100 years, where the silence at dusk is so thick you can almost hold it in your hand. My name is Nadia. I was 34 years old when this story began. I lived alone in a small house that my husband Kofi built before he died. 3 rooms, a tin roof, a garden that I kept because it was the last thing the two of us had planted together. I worked as a wildlife tracker for a conservation group that operated on the western edge of the reserve. I also knew plants, roots, bark, leaves. My grandmother taught me which ones could bring a fever down and which ones could clean a wound that a hospital might have given up on. I wasn't lonely. I want to be clear about that. Lonely is when you want something and don't have it. I had made a kind of peace with my life. I had my work, I had the bush, and I had Lena. Lena was my niece, 8 years old. She came to live with me after her mother, my younger sister, passed. Lena had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she asked more questions before breakfast than most people ask in a week. She was the reason I got up before the sun every morning. She was the reason I came home. That Tuesday in October, I had left Lena with a neighbor and gone out late to check a snare line I'd set for research monitoring, not hunting, just tracking animal movement near the southeastern corridor. I wasn't supposed to be out that late. The light was already going orange and low, but something made me stay. I've never been able to explain that part. I just didn't go home And then I heard it. Not the leopard first. You never hear the leopard first. What I heard was a man screaming, a sound that didn't belong in that landscape at all, high and broken and desperate. And then I heard the low, continuous growl that was answering it. I didn't think. I know people expect me to say I hesitated, that I weighed the risk, that I did something calculated and brave. I didn't. My body just moved. I grabbed the metal rod I carried for clearing brush, I shouted as loud as I have ever shouted in my life, and I ran toward the sound. What I found in that small clearing near the dry riverbed was a man on the ground, one arm up trying to shield his face, and a young female leopard standing over him. She was young, maybe 2 years old, which made her more unpredictable, not less. She hadn't eaten him yet. She was deciding. That's the moment I came in. I don't remember exactly what I did. I remember noise. I remember making myself as large as I could. I remember throwing things, stones, my metal rod, my water bottle. I remember the leopard turning to look at me with those eyes that make you feel like something very old is looking straight through you. And then she left, just like that. She melted back into the bush the way they do, like she was never there at all. The man on the ground was bleeding badly. His left shoulder and arm had deep gashes. His shirt was torn. He was conscious, but barely, drifting in and out, saying something I couldn't understand at first. It took me a moment to realize he was speaking English, Scottish accent, here, in the middle of Savo. I didn't ask questions. I wrapped what I could with the cloth I carried, I got him upright, and I walked him the 40 minutes back to my house. He leaned on me the whole way. He was tall, heavy, and completely silent by the time we reached my door. I laid him on the floor of my front room and I got to work. He was unconscious for nearly 2 full days. I cleaned the wounds, packed them with what I had, watched for infection the way my grandmother had taught me, the color of the skin around the wound, the heat, the smell. By the second day, I was fairly sure he wasn't going to lose the arm. By the third day, he opened his eyes and looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was real. His name was Callum, he told me that much. He had notebooks, lots of them, worn ones, full ones, stacked in a bag that had somehow survived the attack. He had equipment I recognized, soil sampling kits, plant specimen cases, the kind of careful, organized tools that belong to someone who takes their work seriously. He was a botanist, he said, doing solo research. But here is the thing about spending your life reading the bush. You get very good at reading people, too. And something about Callum didn't add up in the quiet way that wrong things never do. He wasn't grateful the way people usually are when they've almost died. Most people, when they come close to the end and then don't reach it, they cry or they shake or they become very talkative, like words can fill up the space where fear used to be. Callum did none of that. He was polite, he was careful, he thanked me with the kind of formality that felt like a wall dressed up as manners. He stayed for 1 week. He ate what I cooked. He played once with Lena, who had decided she liked him because he knew the name of every plant she pointed at. He helped me repair the fence post on the east side of the garden without being asked. And on the 7th morning, he picked up his bag, shook my hand, said thank you in a voice that meant something more than those 2 words can usually carry, and walked away down the red dust road. I watched him go, and I thought, that is a man carrying something very heavy, something heavier than grief, something that had made him come out here alone. I didn't know what it was yet, but I felt it, the same way you feel weather coming before the sky shows any sign of it. 3 weeks passed. Lena was getting worse. She'd had a recurring illness since before she came to me, something in her blood that the clinic in town managed but never fixed, something that would settle down for months and then come roaring back. That October, it came back hard. She was tired all the time. She stopped asking questions at breakfast, and that, more than anything, told me how bad it was. A quiet Lena was a sick Lena. I was sitting with that worry, turning it over every night, when strange things started happening in the village. First, a water project that had been stalled for 2 years, a proper borehole that the community had been trying to fund forever, suddenly got approved. Anonymous donor, no name on the paperwork. The project manager who came to do the survey said he'd been contacted by a foundation, but he couldn't say more than that. Then a medical supply van arrived, fully stocked, pulled up to the community health post one morning and unloaded equipment that little post had been requesting for years. Again, no clear explanation. A foundation, a grant. Somebody, somewhere, had signed something. Elder Mumo, who had been the heartbeat of our village for 30 years, was suspicious. He sat with me one evening and said, "Things that come from nowhere always come from somewhere. We should find out where." He wasn't wrong, but I didn't know where to look yet. And then the letter came. No return address. My name on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside, just 2 sentences. "You didn't just save my life. I'm not sure you know what you saved it from." I'm not an impulsive person. I've never been. But something about those 2 sentences made me move. I found a name on a conservation land use document that had come with the water project paperwork. It matched something Callum had mentioned in passing, a foundation, almost under his breath, like he'd said it by accident. I pulled on that thread. I went to Nairobi. What I found there rearranged everything I thought I understood. Callum wasn't just a botanist doing solo field research. He was the founder of one of the most significant conservation foundations working across East Africa.
He had built it from nothing over 15 years: land protection programs, community partnerships, wildlife corridors, the kind of work that doesn't make headlines but changes landscapes. He had walked away from all of it 18 months before I found him bleeding in the bush. No announcement, no press release. He just stopped, handed the operational reins to a board, and disappeared. I sat in a small office in Nairobi with a woman who had worked with his foundation for a decade, and I asked her why. She looked at me for a long time before she answered. She told me about his daughter. Her name was Isla. She was 6 years old when she got sick. It was treatable, genuinely, completely treatable. But they were far from the right kind of help, caught between what existed and what was needed. By the time they got her to the right place, it was too late. Callum had spent his entire career trying to close those exact gaps for communities across East Africa. And then his own child died inside one of them. He had gone into the bush alone that October because he was saying goodbye. To the land, to the work, maybe to more than that. The woman didn't say it directly, but I understood what she was telling me. I sat in that office for a long time after she stopped talking. The weight of it was enormous, not just sadness, something heavier than sadness, the specific grief of understanding something fully all at once when you weren't prepared for it. I had thought I saved a man from a leopard. I had not understood until that moment what I had actually walked into that evening. The morning the specialist called with the treatment plan, I went outside and sat in the garden, in the dirt, for a long time. Not crying exactly, just breathing, just letting the relief move through me like water finding its level. But Callum didn't stop there. He came back to the foundation, not the same way he had left, not with the same weight, but he came back. And the first project he personally led on his return was a permanent rural health clinic for the southeastern corridor of Savo. Fully staffed, fully supplied, built to serve the communities that had always been too far from everything. It wasn't named after Isla. I asked him about that once. He said he didn't want it to be a monument, he wanted it to be a door, something people walked through on the worst days of their lives and found help on the other side. He called it the Bush Clinic. Simple, honest, exactly right. He asked me to lead the wildlife education program for the foundation, community-based, school-integrated, rooted in the kind of knowledge my grandmother had passed to me, the kind that gets dismissed until someone almost bleeds to death in the bush and realizes it might have just saved them. I almost said no. Old habit. I almost said I was fine where I was, that I didn't need anything to change. And then Lena, who had been listening from the doorway the way she always did, walked over to me, put her hand on my arm and said, "Auntie, you're always telling me not to be afraid of the next thing." I looked at her, healthy, bright-eyed, full of questions again, and I couldn't argue with that. A year later, I stood at the edge of the forest at dusk, the same spot, more or less, where I had run toward that sound, the same orange light, the same red dust, the same ancient quiet pressing in from all sides. The clinic had seen over 400 patients in its first 8 months. The borehole was running clean water to 312 households. Lena was in school, asking her teachers questions they sometimes couldn't answer, which she considered a personal victory. And Callum was in the field again, not alone, not saying goodbye, working, slowly becoming, I think, someone who had found a reason to stay. I'm not going to tell you this is a love story. Maybe it becomes one someday. Maybe it doesn't need to. What I know is that something moved in that clearing when I ran toward the sound. Something shifted, and everything that came after, the clinic, Lena's treatment, the water, the work, all of it traces back to one moment when I didn't stop to calculate the risk. People ask me sometimes if I was brave that evening. I tell them I don't think bravery is the right word. Brave sounds like a choice. What I did didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the only possible thing. I stood at the edge of the forest that evening and I listened to the bush settle into night. Somewhere out there, that young leopard was still moving through the dark, doing exactly what she was built to do. And I thought, me too. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes the stories that find us are the ones we were meant to pass on. Subscribe for more stories like this one. Leave a comment and tell me what part of this stayed with you. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next one.